came close to having a guest speaker tonight. Kurt told Joe Daly that I was under the weather and that Joe was going to be filling in. He begged off, so you're stuck with me again tonight. I will tell you I'm a little tired if you're interested in confessions. We had our grandchildren this past week, and they were perfect, as grandchildren always are, but they were also exhausting. And I can tell the effects of a week with Andy and Abby, but that's a really good thing. And to give you some idea how good it is, Andy said before he left last night, if I've got another week this summer, I'm free. I'm coming back. And I said, come on, you're more than welcome. I think if he gives me a week to rest, I can probably handle it. But 2 weeks in a row, and I'm not sure. It is really good to see all of you out this evening. As Joe mentioned in his prayer, it's been a beautiful day. Just a wonderful time to take in the creation of God and be reminded of how good He is to us. We are extremely blessed and may not express our appreciation as often as we should. Shame on us if that's the case. Every day and throughout the day, we need to stop and just thank God for the blessings that come our way. We're continuing our study of the Gospel of John, and this evening we are in the 4th chapter. I don't know why things play out as they do, but as Paul was reading the scripture reading this evening, I was thinking to myself, a long reading, and who do we call on but Paul Jacoby? He's mentioned on more than one occasion that it seems the longer the reading, more likely it is that he's the one that gets designated to do it. But great job, Paul. We appreciate that. And we can never go wrong when we read from God's Word. In fact, probably we need to have longer readings more often than we do. And in this particular story, I thought it was important that we get a good picture of what is unfolding early in chapter 4. In the Gospel of John, the 7th chapter, and Jesus made a reference to living water. And it's really a play off of the exchange, in my judgment, that unfolded here at Jacob's Well that will be central to tonight's study. But before we look at that segment, we want to break down chapter 4 very quickly for you. The encounter with the Samaritan woman encompasses essentially the first 38 verses. That's followed by Jesus entering the Samaritan village, and the result of that effort, he delayed his journey to Galilee, but in the process was instrumental in bringing a number of Samaritans to faith. And then the chapter closes with the story of the healing of the nobleman's son. And it hasn't been all that long ago when we took some time and looked at that story with a little greater scrutiny. But it's a marvelous example of the power of Jesus and how he was able to demonstrate that power over time and distance with tremendously positive results. And that's how chapter 4 closes. Let's look now at the encounter between Jesus and the Samaritan woman. The specific encounter is recorded in verses 1 through 8. And the map you see is obviously a map of Israel. Remember that we're looking primarily at that piece of geography that is east of the Mediterranean, but west of the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River, and the Dead Sea. It's actually a body of land about a third the size of the state of Ohio. And in the first century, it was broken down into 3 sections. The northern section, that area west of the Sea of Galilee, was called quite naturally Galilee. Jesus was from Nazareth, a city in Galilee. And when his ministry unfolded, he made Capernaum his city, a city in Galilee on the coast of the Sea of Galilee. The section south of Galilee was called Samaria. It was inhabited principally by Samaritans, and you know that Jesus, on at least one occasion, in fact, if you read the Gospels carefully, on more than one occasion, elevated the Samaritans in a way that Jews typically did not. Think Luke chapter 10 and the story of the Good Samaritan. Many Jews who wished to go from Judea to Galilee or from Galilee to Judea would actually go east, north of the Sea of Galilee, then south, and ultimately cross west the Jordan River into Judea so that they wouldn't have to set foot on Samaritan land. In this case, Jesus is leaving Judea on his way back home to Galilee and makes a point of passing through Samaria, unlike many other Jews would have done by avoiding this region. They just simply wanted nothing to do with the Samaritans because this particular section of Judea had been conquered by the Assyrians, who uprooted Jews and resettled them in foreign lands and brought foreigners in and settled them in Samaria. As a result of problems that arose after that settlement was undertaken, it was argued that the problems were because the Samaritans were not worshiping the right gods. And so a Jewish priest was brought back to Samaria and taught the law, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, to the Samaritans. And they were quasi-worshipers of God. They had a temple at Gerizim, and they had a priesthood as well, but they were an abomination to the Jews, and thus the typical Jew avoided that region, but Jesus was not typical for his day. Now, we look at the text, and it's obvious that Jesus realizes that he needs to change his base of operation. This is what leads to the story that is about to unfold. He's headed to Galilee, but he must needs go through Samaria. And the need is one that he feels personally. He is going to go this way to make a point. Jesus recognized that every soul had value. He never saw people as being better or worse than other people. He didn't make the kinds of distinctions that are often made today. And that's a wonderful thing. My daughter and son-in-law are doing a great job raising our grandchildren to not see people in any other way than just people. To give you an illustration of this, one of our folks refers to Andy as Little Roger. And he was commenting to us about that, and we said, well, who is it? And he said, well, it's somebody about your age, and that's as close as he could get. He's talking about Harry, but he doesn't know that Harry is black. I only found out a little while ago because he doesn't see color. He really doesn't. It just didn't register. Never occurred to say that. That's how Jesus saw people. He saw what they were on the inside, every one of us, made in the image of God and with real value, and that included the Samaritans, contrary to what his fellow Jews believed. And so it is essential that he go home this way to make the point that he will soon make with the Samaritan woman. It is at Sychar, near Jacob's well, a place that, by the way, is still identifiable today. And you can, if you're a mind to, get the background for this well and other events that would have occurred there. What I have gotten for you is merely a representation, an artist's representation of the encounter. There's no way that I would indicate to you that it's authentic. It's just one man's view of what transpired when Jesus and the Samaritan woman are brought together at the well. And the time is about noon. The text says the 6th hour, but if we were to put that in modern language, we would say it was lunchtime, noon. And where are the disciples at this time? We will soon learn their whereabouts. Jesus and the woman are essentially alone, and what he does is, to the woman's great surprise, he asks for a drink of water. Now, understand that this is so dramatic because she's a Samaritan, she's a woman, and she's a woman of questionable character, and yet Jesus doesn't hesitate to acknowledge, you have something that I would like. Could I possibly have a drink of water? And quite frankly, it shocked her. I wouldn't say it surprised her. I would really say it shocked her. Where were the disciples? What time is it? Noon. And what happens around noon? People get hungry. Isn't it interesting that this story occurred nearly 2,000 years ago, but people were still eating at noon then? They were in town buying lunch. I don't know if they went to McDonald's or Wendy's, folks. I don't really care. And obviously I'm being facetious. They just went into town to get lunch. But Jesus didn't go. He had better things to do. And there are more important things than eating. I have said repeatedly in many, many places that I do not live to eat. I just eat to live. And I didn't know if anybody ever paid any attention to that or not, but I was in a gospel meeting this spring, hadn't been there in some time, and somebody came to me and said, you know, I will never forget one thing you said in a sermon. I thought, oh, what was it? I'm really curious. They said, well, you said that you did not live to eat, you ate to live, and I've never forgotten that. What a thing to remember, but it's true. And Jesus, unlike his disciples, was focused on matters that really mattered more than filling a belly. But before we go further, I want you to think back for a moment to what we discussed last Sunday night. Chapter 3, who's the central character in that story as it relates to Jesus? A man by the name of Nicodemus. And we go from Nicodemus to the Samaritan woman. And in that transition, there is a real contrast. And before we continue in the text, I want you to understand the contrast. Nicodemus is a Jew. The woman is a Samaritan. He was a man. Again, she was a woman. And that is far more significant in the first century than in the 21st century. He was learned, that is, educated man. She was in all probability very uneducated or only slightly educated, and quite frankly, ignorant of the true plan of God. He was morally upright, and she was sinful. Not that Nicodemus was sinless, but you can make the contrast between someone who's seeking to live a godly life and someone who isn't, and that's the contrast between chapters 3 and 4, between Nicodemus and the Samaritan woman. He was wealthy, and from the upper crust, she was poor, and probably, given her moral predicament, an outcast. She seems to be alone with Jesus, and the typical hour to go to the well to draw water was not noon. But it may simply be that she's there at noon because this way she avoids the other women from the village who would no doubt shun her and probably make snide remarks about her behind her back. And so she's at the well at a time when you would normally not expect the women to be there. That a woman is at the well is not surprising because, after all, drawing water and toting water was woman's work. It still is in some parts of the world today. But I would never suggest to you that that would be the case this evening. But in this case, that was true, and it's quite a contrast. Furthermore, Nicodemus recognized the merits of Jesus. He acknowledged, you're someone special. You couldn't do the things that you do. Chapter 3, verse 2, unless God is with you. This woman, quite frankly, is at the moment clueless. Jesus is at best a curious traveler. And furthermore, Nicodemus was very serious and dignified. And she's somewhat flippant and perhaps even boisterous. Who do you think you are? And that's out of the context of an offer that he makes in the course of their conversation, which unfolds in verses 9 through 38. He says, you know what? I may have asked water from you, but I have water I can give you that you can drink and never thirst again. I can almost hear her laughing out loud at such an idea. I would like to have water that I could take one drink and never need to drink again. I'd like to be able to eat one meal and never have to eat again. That would be fine with me. Again, I do not live to eat, I eat to live. I know people that are just the opposite. They wouldn't agree with me about just one meal and be fine. I'd like to fill my tank up one time and never have to fill it again. I'd like to buy one pair of shoes and one suit of clothes, one shirt, one tie. And quite honestly, I would be content to wear them every day of the week if they didn't wear out and I could keep them clean. But that just doesn't work that way. That's not the way life is. And when he starts talking about living water, there are all kinds of questions obviously developing in this woman's mind. How is it, she asked, that you, being a Jew, would ask a drink of me, a Samaritan woman? I just don't get this. Why are you making this request? And when he offers her living water, she's again clueless, because how can you take one drink and never drink again? You see, people tend to think literally, and Jesus is speaking figuratively. He is not really talking about H2O, or to write it out correctly, to H2O. He's talking about something that's even more important. He also told his disciples, just for a little background, I have meat, food to eat that you don't know about, verse 32. And he wasn't really talking about food, was he? He was talking about he had a mission to accomplish, work to do, and they still don't really get it. They don't know who he is for sure, and they clearly don't understand what he has come to accomplish. But in this conversation, he's trying to set that out. Well, that statement, I have water that you can drink and never drink again, leads into a religious discussion, which is wonderful. She's a Samaritan. She has some knowledge of the Samaritan religion. He's a Jew, and yes, she has a cursory knowledge of Judaism. And the clear distinction is, we worship in the mountain, meaning Mount Gerizim, and you worship in Jerusalem. Just which one is right? Where should we worship? May I submit to you that this is never a crucial question? Geography is not important. I can think of one congregation that had the opportunity to buy a new building at a very good price and leave an old building that it was in need of much repair and certainly wasn't adequate. And they made the transition, but there were a couple of folks that couldn't part ways with the geography. You realize how sad that is? It isn't where that matters. It's the who and the how that counts. And that's what Jesus essentially said to the woman when she wants to know, is it Gerizim or Jerusalem? Really, Gerizim or Zion. Jesus says, that's not the question. It's not a matter of where. It's who are we worshiping and how are we worshiping. And this led to her coming to terms with who he really was. This is the Messiah. He says that God's a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. I understand that, by the way, to mean with the right attitude. We can engage in all of the right things, but if our heart is not in it, our attitude is not right, the fact that we're doing right things is not terribly beneficial if we're not also doing them for the right reason. Think back to the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6, 1 through 18. Good things being done for wrong reasons accomplish no real spiritual benefits. So she comes to conclude, as a direct result of the conversation, without seeing any miracle, just listening to Jesus and hearing him address her question in a way she never expected, this guy, he's not ordinary. He's extraordinary. He is the Messiah. And Jesus was essentially saying to her, you know, I really have pressing work. There are souls at stake, men and women to be rescued and redeemed. That reminds me of what Jesus said in Matthew 9 about the harvest being plentiful, but the laborers are few. You go out into the harvest and become reapers for the Lord. You know, that's still his message to the church today. Our role as Christians is just not to find a couple of hours every Lord's Day to come together in a setting like this. As important as this setting is, if we don't walk out of here determined to live for Jesus and to encourage others to come to know him, obey him, and live for him, we've lost sight of what the church is all about. So I look at this encounter and I ask myself, what should I take from it? There's some obvious lessons. First and foremost, Jesus was not, unlike most Jews and most Samaritans, a respecter of persons. You say, well, how do you know that most Jews were that way? I've read the Bible, like I hope you have. You probably remember Peter, who is summoned to the household of Cornelius. But he's not going to go unless there is a divine intervention and a commission from above that says they deserve to hear the gospel just like the Jews. That sheet that came down from heaven filled with all kinds of animals, and the voice of God commanding Peter, rise, kill, and eat. And there were clean and unclean animals, and Peter said no. Just always wrong to say no to God. I'm just up front. Don't forget that. He said, nothing common or unclean has ever entered my mouth. And then God said, what I've cleansed, you should not call common or unclean. You see, now you must come to understand that every person is made in my image. Every soul has value. Jesus died for the world to redeem humanity. And we need to be reaching out without regard to externals. We cannot focus on the color of someone's skin, on their social standing, their dress, their education, their bank account, the kind of car they drive. None of that matters with God, nor should it ever matter with God's people. That's the first lesson that ought to flow from an understanding of John 4. And I am sorry to tell you that in the church today, there are still people who are prejudicial and bigoted. There are anti-Semitics in the church today. And there are those who have not yet learned to be colorblind, have yet to discover the value of every precious soul. Shame on us if we're among that number. Because first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, you don't matter to God more than other people, and they don't matter less. He loves us all with an immeasurable love and made an unspeakable or unthinkable gift, 1 or 2 Corinthians 9:15, in the sacrifice of his Son. This woman, at the time she had her encounter with Jesus, had been married 5 times and is now living with a man outside the bonds of wedlock. I think that in the first century, she would have been considered to have been living an immoral life. In the 21st century, most folks are not going to bat an eye at this. But I cite it for your consideration. She may have been living an immoral life, but her soul still had value with God. Some time ago, I know I did this here and I've done it other places. I would take a bill out of my wallet. I would spit on it, crinkle it, throw it on the ground and step on it, and then raise it up and say, anybody still want it? Now, I'm not going to do that tonight because sure enough, somebody will be up here expecting to get it. But you know, it doesn't matter how wrinkled, how marred, how dirty, how abused it is, it still has value. If that's true of a $20 bill or a $50 bill, how much more must that be the case with people made in the image of God? Jesus knew that. He got it. We better get it too. There is no one in our community who is beyond the pale of God's love, the scope of God's grace, or someone that we should not seek to reach with the story of Jesus. I try never to let anyone enter our building without making sure that they're invited back to worship with us and learn more about Jesus, because they have value. And frankly, we deal with folks who are not always the nicest people in the world. Unless you're around here 24/7, you just don't you're clueless. You just don't get it. And people often are not very appreciative of the help you give them. They don't feel like we're helping them. They just deserve it. That's the mentality of many in modern America, and sadly many around the world. But their souls still have value. We still need to treat them the way we would want to be treated by them. We still need to love them, even though they may not appear very lovable. And we still need to try to reach them with the message of Jesus. If you can't see that in this story, you just don't understand the story. This woman, like all of us, have value in spite of her lifestyle. God could use her. Now, how do I know that? Because I know what follows. Now, let me stop for a moment and make certain you understand. Jesus did not endorse, approve of her immoral actions, but he loved her. And he sought to lift her out of the mire of sin and point her heavenward. And what happened as a result? Through her influence, the good influence of a bad woman, many believed on him for the saying, the testimony of the woman. I don't care what sin lies in your past, the blood of Christ is sufficient to wash that sin away. Yes, there are conditions, among them repentance. When we get to John 8 and we revisit the story of the adulterous woman, Jesus, in my estimation, clearly forgave her. Neither do I condemn you, but not without further saying, go and sin no more. The world would say, it doesn't matter what you're doing, how you're living. God loves you. Jesus died for you. It's okay. But Jesus would say, I love you, but you've got to make some changes. And you can be used in a powerful way. No matter who you are, what your background may be, if you will allow yourself to be used as this woman did. Here is a man not too busy. They wanted him to stay, and he didn't hesitate to stay until others were made aware of who he was and what he demanded. I've always said that any preacher who's too busy to be around people ought not be preaching. If we're too busy to be bothered, we ought not bother with preaching, because we'll never be effective. Jesus was accessible, and those who follow him must be accessible as well. I have really tried to communicate that to you. That's why I've told you, call any of my phones, call any hour, day or night. If anybody gets upset, it won't be me. And I'll do whatever I can to help you. Because if we can't make ourselves available, something's wrong. Jesus could change his plans if it meant the salvation of souls, because he knew the value of souls. Let's move now to the healing of the nobleman's son. You got a man here who has an earnest plea. I've got a son, and he's very, very sick. Point of death. And I don't have anywhere else to turn. I can't imagine being in that predicament, to be honest with you. I mentioned, I think, Mother's Day this past May, that we spent one Mother's Day at my mother's in my entire preaching ministry, and I was there 5 minutes. Long enough for one of my nephews to put my son on a bike and watch him ride into a barbed wire fence. I rushed him to Fairmont General, I think, St. Joseph, Wheeling. I would have taken him to the moon to get help for that boy. I drove from Fairmont to Parkersburg well over 80 miles an hour, and I really didn't care. You know, there are just some times when matters are so important, and I was probably slow by Ted Patterson standards, but, you know, my son needed to see a surgeon. They said at Fairmont General, we just don't have anybody. He's going to see who he needs to see. We get to St. Joe, and the guy in the ER says, well, we got a guy here that can do it, but there's a board-certified surgeon in Wheeling. I said, you mean we should take him? I can't tell you that, but there's a board-certified surgeon in Wheeling. Enough said, off to Wheeling we go. And if from Wheeling they'd have said you need to go to Timbuktu, we would have gone there. You do what you have to do, and that's what this man does. He's heard of Jesus. If anybody can help, this man can help. And I'm not going to be satisfied until I've seen him. Jesus, in the course of this miracle, indicted some for refusing to believe unless they could see signs, but you know, this nobleman was not among that number. The simple reply to the man was, go your way, your son lives. Another map, and I want you to look at this map because the man lives in Capernaum and the miracle's occurring elsewhere, and Jesus doesn't see the boy at all. He just speaks the word. Never touched the boy, never saw the boy, wasn't even in close proximity to him, yet he spoke and it was done. That's the power of the God we worship, his Son, our Savior we serve. And we must never forget that power. The Father believed the words of Jesus. If you say it, I believe it will be so. And he heads home to be greeted with the information that, you know, the boy's better. He's alive. When did it happen? And they told him at the very hour that Jesus said, your son lives. You know, how can you look at chapter 4 and not walk away with a greater appreciation for who Jesus was, what he did, and therefore what that ought to mean to all of us? And why is that story there with all the others? So we would be believers. It's just one of many of the miracles Jesus performed in the course of his ministry, each one designed to lead us to faith, but a specific kind of faith, one that is living, active, and obedient, that does what is demanded of us without hesitation, without argument, without alteration. It just says, speak, Lord, your servant hears, and hearing obeys. If you're in this assembly tonight and you're not a Christian, I can offer you no hope. I don't know what the future holds for our world or for any of us personally. I don't need to know because I know that the future's in God's hands, and as a Christian, it's well with us. But if you're not a child of God, what happens tonight on your way home if there's a terrible accident and your life is lost? You're lost eternally. What happens if this is it? The last day, Jesus comes. The world and everything in it melts with a fervent heat. You're more than toast. You're lost eternally. But if you're a Christian, you're just headed to heaven, home at last. You can trust Jesus. You have every reason to believe and obey, and none not to, and the urgency should be apparent to all of us. So as we sing this song,